It was late one evening, sometime in early autumn, when I was home alone in the small house I had recently started renting. It was on a quiet street at the edge of town, the kind of place where you could go hours without seeing a car drive by. I had moved in only a few months earlier and still wasn't fully used to the isolation. The house had that constant, faint creak of wood expanding and settling, a kind of breathing sound that older homes get when they're surrounded by empty space. It was cozy during the day, but at night it felt like the walls listened. That evening started normally. I spent most of the day cleaning and doing laundry. I remember the smell of detergent still lingering in the hallway. I made a simple dinner, eggs, toast, and tea, and ate while scrolling through my phone. It was around 8:30 when I washed the dishes and turned off the main lights. I liked keeping only a small lamp on in the living room. The soft orange glow was enough to see around but left most of the house dim. Outside, it was already dark. The air had cooled, and the faint sound of crickets came through the slightly open kitchen window. I sat on the couch with a blanket and watched something on TV without really paying attention. The house was quiet except for the low sound of the TV and the occasional car passing somewhere far down the street. After a while, I turned the volume down and noticed how quiet it actually was. I could hear my own breathing and the faint tick of the clock in the kitchen. Around 10 o'clock, I decided to take a shower before bed. I paused the show, stretched, and walked toward the bathroom. I remember looking at the back door as I passed through the kitchen. The door had a small glass window, and it looked out into the backyard. It was pitch black beyond it. I always felt uneasy walking past that door at night because you couldn't see anything outside, but if someone was standing there, they could see in. I checked the lock like I always did. The deadbolt was secure. The bathroom was small, and the mirror fogged up quickly once I turned on the hot water. I stayed in longer than usual, trying to shake off the feeling of cold that always came with the fall air. When I got out, I dried off, put on sweatpants and a t-shirt, and wiped the condensation from the mirror. My reflection looked strange in the half-fogged glass, pale from the bathroom light. I turned it off, and the house instantly felt colder and quieter. When I stepped into the hallway, I noticed something. The lamp I'd left on in the living room was off. The room was dark now, completely dark. I stopped walking for a moment. I was sure I had left it on because I hadn't turned off any lights after dinner except the ones in the kitchen. I stood still, trying to think if maybe the bulb had burned out or if I had accidentally flipped the switch when I passed by earlier. But even that didn't make sense. It was one of those lamps with a pull chain, not a wall switch. I felt uneasy but told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe a power flicker, though nothing else had turned off. I walked slowly into the living room, the floor cool under my bare feet. I reached for the lamp and pulled the chain. Turned on immediately. The bulb worked fine. That made my chest tighten a little because that meant someone or something had turned it off. I turned to look toward the front window. The curtains were drawn, but I could still see the faint glow of the streetlight seeping in from the edges. I went around and made sure both doors, front and back, were locked. They were. Everything seemed fine. I took a deep breath and went back toward my bedroom, trying to push away the uneasiness that had started creeping in. I left the living room light on this time. When I got into my room, I closed the door and sat on the bed. The digital clock beside me read 10:47. I scrolled through my phone again for a while before setting it down. I lay back and stared at the ceiling. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator down the hall and the occasional pop from the heater. It must have been around midnight when I woke up again. I didn't remember falling asleep, but my body tensed as soon as I opened my eyes. The first thing I noticed was that the light from the living room, which should have been glowing faintly under my door, was gone. It was completely dark. At first, I thought maybe the power had gone out, but then I realized I could still hear the refrigerator humming faintly in the distance. The power was fine. The light had been turned off. My stomach dropped. I sat up slowly and listened. The house was dead silent. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Then I heard it, a faint creak of a floorboard from somewhere in the hallway. It was soft, deliberate, and unmistakable. It wasn't a settling sound. It was weight. Someone was standing out there. I stayed completely still. My mouth went dry. I strained to hear anything else. A few seconds passed, and then came another soft creak, closer this time. I could feel my pulse in my ears. My phone was on the nightstand next to me, but I didn't want to move too fast. I reached for it slowly, keeping my eyes on the door. The floor outside my room creaked again. Then it stopped. Silence. I didn't know what to do. My window was behind me, but it had one of those old locks that made a loud click when turned. I knew the sound would give me away if I tried to open it. My mind was racing. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was the house. Maybe... Then I saw something that froze me completely. A shadow moved under the gap of my bedroom door. It was faint but clear, the shape of someone's feet standing just outside. They weren't moving. Whoever it was just stood there, couldn't breathe. Every second felt like it lasted forever. The shadow stayed for what felt like a full minute, then slowly moved away. I heard another quiet step, then another, heading toward the living room. That was enough. I grabbed my phone, stood up, and went to the window. I unlocked it as quietly as I could, pushed it up, and climbed out into the cold night air. The ground was wet from the earlier rain, and the grass soaked through my socks instantly. I crouched low and moved toward the side fence, keeping the house in view. My breath came out in quick, white clouds. When I got to the front yard, I stopped behind a tree and looked back at the house. Through the thin gap in the curtains, I could see faint movement. Someone walking slowly across the living room. I couldn't make out details, just the outline of a person moving between the furniture. Then the light flicked on again, the same lamp that had been off earlier. I turned and ran straight down the street to a neighbor's house 2 doors down. My hands were shaking so hard I almost slipped on the steps. I banged on their door until I saw movement inside. I stepped back, looking over my shoulder at my own house. The lights were still on. When the police arrived, they went through the place carefully. The back door's frame had a thin crack near the latch, like it had been forced open with something flat, maybe a crowbar or screwdriver. The officers said it was likely someone trying to see if the house was occupied. There had been other break-ins reported nearby, all while people were sleeping. The person had probably thought I wasn't home. Maybe they panicked when they realized someone was there. They hadn't taken anything, just left through the same back door they came in from. But what scared me most was how quiet they had been. They must have been inside for a while before I even woke up. I moved out 2 weeks later. Even though I changed the locks before then, I couldn't relax. Every night, I'd wake up and think I heard footsteps or see a flicker of movement in the hallway. The silence of that house, which I used to think was peaceful, became unbearable. What stuck with me most wasn't the fact that someone had broken in, it was how carefully they moved. They turned lights off, stood still for long stretches, and waited outside my door. It wasn't a smash and grab. It was quiet, patient, and every time I think back to that night, I remember the moment the shadow under the door stopped moving, when it just stood there. That was the part that gets to me the most. The silence wasn't just empty, it was listening back. I was 17 the first time I stayed home alone for an entire weekend. My parents had gone out of town to visit my aunt who lived about 3 hours away, and I had decided to stay behind because of schoolwork and a part-time job I had that Saturday morning. I wasn't nervous about being home alone. I liked having the space to myself. The house was familiar, quiet, and safe. It sat in a peaceful neighborhood where everyone knew each other, the kind of place where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. That Friday night was calm. I made myself some pasta, watched a few shows, and went through my usual bedtime routine. Around 11:30 p.m., I walked through the house, checking each lock like my mom always did before bed. The front door, the back door, the small window in the laundry room, all locked. The night outside was cold, with a light breeze that rattled the trees a bit, but otherwise still. Satisfied, I went upstairs, turned off the hallway light, and got into bed. I fell asleep quickly. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but I remember how still the room felt. My body was warm under the blanket, but my face was cold. Colder than it should have been. I realized then that a draft was coming from somewhere. The air in the room felt different, like when a door is slightly open and the air from outside drifts in. I sat up, disoriented at first, and listened. The house was quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock on my nightstand. Then I heard it, a soft creak, like wood bending somewhere downstairs. I tried to ignore it. Old houses make noises all the time. Maybe it was the heating system. I pulled the blanket closer and turned to my side, but I couldn't relax. Something in me felt off. A strange, uneasy awareness that wasn't there before. The draft wasn't stopping either. Felt stronger now, brushing against my cheek. I got out of bed, shivering a little as my feet touched the cold floor, and grabbed the small flashlight I kept by the nightstand. I didn't turn on the main light because I didn't want to flood the house with brightness if I was just imagining things. I opened my bedroom door and stepped into the hallway. It was dark except for the soft glow of the streetlight outside filtering through the curtains. As I reached the top of the stairs, I noticed that faint movement in the air again, the cool draft flowing upward. That meant a door or window downstairs had to be open. My chest tightened a bit, but I tried to tell myself I might have forgotten to lock something. Maybe I hadn't turned the bolt all the way on the front door. That thought made sense enough to calm me a little. I went down the stairs slowly, one step at a time, flashlight in hand. The beam of light shook slightly with each heartbeat. When I reached the bottom, I saw the front door right away. It was closed, but the lock was turned the wrong way. I knew I had locked it before bed. I remembered checking it. The realization made my stomach drop. I reached for the door handle, checking it carefully. It was cold to the touch, and the latch was loose, like someone had pulled on it. The small rug in front of the door was slightly pushed out of place. My heart was pounding now, every sound in the house magnified. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock in the living room, even the sound of my own breathing. Then I noticed something else. Right near the rug, faintly visible in the soft light coming from the window, were footprints. Muddy, dark, and large, far bigger than mine. They led from the front door toward the hallway that connected to the kitchen. The prints were heavy, spaced apart like someone had been walking slowly. I stood frozen, staring at them, unable to move. The smell hit me next, a faint damp scent, like wet earth mixed with something stale, the kind of smell that clings to clothes after being outside in the cold. My hands were trembling. Whoever had made those prints hadn't come in hours ago. The mud still looked fresh, wet enough to glisten under the flashlight. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on the hallway. I didn't hear anything, no footsteps or voices, no sound of movement, but the air felt heavy, like someone was still nearby, just out of sight. I couldn't make myself look toward the kitchen. I didn't want to see what was at the end of those footprints. I turned off my flashlight, moving as quietly as I could, and went back up the stairs. Every creak in the wood made my heart jump. I closed my bedroom door softly, locked it, and pushed a chair under the handle. My hands were shaking so much that I dropped my phone twice before finally unlocking it. I called my next-door neighbor, the only person I could think of at that moment who was close enough to help. The minutes after that felt endless. I sat on the floor near my bed, staring at the door, every sound amplified in the silence. I thought I heard something at one point, a dull thud, like something falling in the kitchen, but it stopped quickly. My body was tense, my eyes fixed on the shadow under the door, waiting for movement that never came. Eventually, I saw headlights through my window. My mom had called my neighbor and then started driving home immediately after hearing what happened. When she arrived, it was close to 4 a.m. I didn't go downstairs until she called up to me. The first thing I noticed when I stepped back into the hallway was how cold the air felt. When we walked down together, I saw that the footprints were still there, though they had started to dry and fade a little. The front door was closed again, but the lock was twisted slightly, like it had been forced. In the kitchen, one of the windows above the sink had a cracked latch. It looked like someone had tried to push it open from the outside, probably before realizing they could just use the front door instead. On the counter, a few things were out of place. One of the chairs had been moved slightly, and some of the couch cushions in the living room were turned around. It was small, almost unnoticeable stuff, but not how I had left it. We never found out who it was. The police came later that morning, took a few photos, and said it was likely someone looking for money or a warm place to stay during the night. Maybe they didn't expect anyone to be home. The fresh mud suggested they had come in not long before I woke up. Maybe just minutes. That thought bothered me more than anything. I kept imagining what might have happened if I had gone into the kitchen instead of turning back. If I had followed those muddy prints just a few seconds longer. Whoever it was must have realized I had locked myself upstairs, decided to leave quietly, and slipped out before my mom got back. For weeks after that, I couldn't sleep properly. Every time the wind rattled the window or the floor creaked, I'd jolt awake, my heart racing. I double-checked every lock, every window, sometimes 3 or 4 times before bed. Even now, years later, I still remember that smell, that faint mix of wet dirt and cold air that lingered in the house for days afterward. It's the kind of thing that stays with you. It wasn't the sound or even the footprints that haunted me the most. It was knowing that for a few minutes, someone was inside my home while I was asleep, walking through the same halls I had walked, close enough that if I had woken up just a little earlier, I might have seen them. I was staying at my friend's house for the weekend. His family had gone out of town for a wedding, and I offered to watch the place for a couple of nights. I didn't think much of it at first. It was just a quiet suburban home, in a safe neighborhood with a backyard and a small driveway. I'd stayed there before, so it felt familiar. I had my bag, a few snacks, and my phone. I figured I'd spend the night watching TV, scrolling through my phone, and just relaxing. It was late fall, and the air outside had that dry chill that comes when winter is creeping in. I remember locking all the doors before settling down. I double-checked everything, even though it wasn't my house, just because being alone in someone else's place always made me a little uneasy. The house had that stillness that only comes when you're completely by yourself. Every sound felt louder, more noticeable. It was around 10:30 p.m. when I turned off most of the lights, leaving only the living room lamp on. I was lying on the couch watching something forgettable on TV. The neighborhood outside was completely dark, the kind where the streetlights don't reach every corner, and the silence feels almost too thick. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house settling. Around 11, there was a knock on the front door. Not a loud one, just 2 quick knocks. I froze. I wasn't expecting anyone. The family wasn't due back until the next evening. At first, I thought maybe one of the neighbors had come by, maybe to check on something. The house had a small window near the front door, but it was too high up for me to see out without standing on my toes. I hesitated, then walked toward the door quietly. I didn't say anything, just listened. Nothing. I stood there for a few seconds, hearing only the faint sound of my own breathing and the soft ticking of the wall clock behind me. I waited maybe half a minute before I slowly turned the knob and opened the door. No one was there. The porch light was on, and the small front yard was empty. The street beyond looked deserted. Not a single car, not a single person walking by. just that pale yellow glow from the light falling on the concrete walkway and the thin, leafless trees. The cold air rushed in, and I felt a weird shiver run through me that wasn't just from the temperature. I shut the door and locked it again, telling myself it was probably just a prank or maybe a delivery driver who got the wrong address. I tried to brush it off and went back to the couch, but I couldn't shake that uneasy feeling. Every few minutes, I found myself glancing at the door, expecting another knock. It didn't happen again for a while. I turned up the TV a little, just to fill the silence, but the noise didn't help. I noticed every sound around me: the pipes, the wind, even the distant hum of traffic miles away. The house had 2 stories and I was on the lower floor. My friend's family mostly used the upstairs bedrooms, but I didn't go up there since I didn't need to. It must have been close to midnight when I heard the sound. It was faint at first, like someone walking upstairs. Slow, steady steps moving from one side of the ceiling to the other. At first, I thought it was my imagination or maybe the house creaking from the temperature drop. But it kept going. The rhythm was too deliberate. I sat completely still, staring up at the ceiling, trying to tell myself there had to be a normal explanation. But there shouldn't have been anyone up there. The family had taken everything valuable with them, and all the bedroom doors upstairs were closed when I arrived. The footsteps stopped for a few seconds, then started again, this time closer to the area directly above where I was sitting. My heart started pounding. The air in the living room suddenly felt heavier, like the temperature had dropped even more. I turned off the TV so I could listen better. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Then I heard a soft creak, like the sound of a door upstairs moving slightly. I stood up slowly and looked toward the staircase. The light from the living room barely reached that part of the house, so the top of the stairs was just a dark shadow. I couldn't see anything, but I couldn't bring myself to walk closer either. I didn't want to believe it was what it sounded like, but it was too distinct. Someone was moving upstairs. I could hear small, irregular sounds. A light scrape, a shift in weight, the faint sound of something brushing against the floor. I felt completely frozen. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to call out. I didn't want to move. I just stood there, staring at that dark stairway, waiting for something to happen. After maybe 30 seconds, I slowly backed away and went into the kitchen. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone. I didn't call my friend. It was too late, and I didn't think he'd answer. Instead, I called 911. I didn't even go into detail at first. I just said I was house sitting, that I thought someone was inside. They told me to stay on the line and wait outside. I grabbed my jacket and slipped on my shoes as quietly as I could. I remember how slow those few seconds felt. Like every movement I made echoed through the house. As I passed the bottom of the stairs again, I heard it, one clear footstep above me. Not creaking this time. It was heavier, deliberate. I didn't look back. I just left. Outside, the air felt freezing against my face, but I didn't care. I went straight to my car, locked the doors, and sat there with the engine off and my phone still in my hand. I watched the house from the driveway, the living room light glowing faintly through the window. Nothing moved. The police arrived maybe 15 minutes later. 2 cars. They searched the house for nearly half an hour while I sat in my car, barely breathing. When one of the officers finally came out, he told me there were signs someone had been inside. A back window latch had been broken, and they found muddy footprints near the upstairs hallway. Whoever it was must have escaped before they got there. I didn't go back inside after that. I just sat in the car until the officers were done. They told me it looked like a break-in. Probably someone who thought the house was empty for the weekend. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I told my friend what happened, and he said the police found clear prints near the back of the house, leading into the woods behind their yard. The person must have been hiding somewhere inside before I even got there, waiting for a chance to get out. That thought stuck with me. that I had been sitting downstairs for hours while someone was upstairs the whole time. I didn't sleep properly for weeks after that. Every small sound in my apartment made me tense up. I kept replaying the moment I opened that front door, wondering if whoever it was had been watching from an upstairs window, waiting for me to move. Even now, when I think about it, I can still hear the sound, those slow, steady footsteps above me in that quiet house, and the way they stopped right when I realized I wasn't alone. I had been living alone in that small one-bedroom apartment for about 6 months when the sounds started. It was a quiet building, only 8 units, most of them rented by older people or couples who worked long hours. Mine was on the second floor, near the back, facing a narrow alley and a small line of trees. It wasn't the nicest place, but it was cheap, clean, and warm enough to get through winter. The building had thin walls and old floors that creaked if you walked too fast, but I got used to that quickly. What I didn't get used to were the footsteps. It started one night in the middle of December. The first snowstorm of the year had hit hard that week, and the world outside was buried in white. I was half asleep around 2 in the morning when I heard what sounded like someone walking directly above my ceiling. Slow, heavy steps, one after another, pacing from one end of the apartment to the other. The sound was muffled but distinct. I could even feel a faint vibration under the ceiling plaster as the footsteps passed overhead. At first, I assumed it was just one of my neighbors. Maybe someone couldn't sleep. It was an old building, after all, and sound carried strangely through it. But the thing that made it strange was that the apartment above mine had been empty since I'd moved in. The landlord told me he was renovating it slowly, fixing the floors and wiring before listing it again. The windows above me had been dark for months. Still, that night, I told myself that maybe he was working late, or maybe someone had started renting it without me knowing. The next morning, when I went outside to clear the snow from my car, I looked up at the apartment above mine. The windows were still completely dark and covered with a thin layer of frost from the inside. No footprints led up to its front door on the balcony walkway, only thick, untouched snow. That's when it really hit me that no one had been up there. The second night, the footsteps started again at almost the exact same time, somewhere between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m. The same steady rhythm. They'd move from one side of the ceiling to the other, pause, then start again. It sounded like pacing over and over for nearly half an hour. Sometimes it was just walking. Other times I could hear a slow, dragging noise, like something being pulled across the floor. The building was old enough that every sound above my ceiling made the wood creak and flex faintly, so it was impossible to ignore. I barely slept that night. I lay there on my back, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding each time the steps started again. I tried turning up my phone's white noise app, covering my head with a blanket, but it didn't help. It wasn't just sound anymore. I could feel the movement above me. By the third night, I was already exhausted. I remember sitting on the couch late that evening, trying to convince myself it was something simple. Maybe the building settling or animals in the attic. But I'd lived in enough apartments to know what those things sounded like. This was different. It was too regular, too heavy. And then there was the timing. Every night, just after 2 in the morning, it would begin. Never earlier, never later. That night, it lasted longer than before. The pacing went on for almost an hour. Then came something new. A loud creak, like a door opening. I didn't even know there was a door above me, but the sound was clear. Then a sharp thump, like something dropping on the floor. My hands were shaking as I sat there, trying to focus on the faint hum of my refrigerator, anything to drown it out. After that, I started hearing it every single night. I'd go to bed early, hoping to sleep through it, but I'd always wake up just before it started, like my body already knew it was coming. The footsteps, the creaks, sometimes even the faint sound of wood bending under weight. I started losing track of time during the days, always tired, always on edge. One night, around 2:30 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and a broom and went out into the hallway. The entire building was silent except for the faint hum of the old heating system. I walked up the back stairs to the third floor where the supposedly vacant apartment was. The hallway light flickered slightly, and the floor was cold under my feet. When I got to the door above my unit, I saw that it was still locked with a chain and covered in a thick layer of dust around the handle. No footprints, no marks, nothing disturbed. I stood there for a while, flashlight in hand, listening. No sounds came from inside. The next morning, I called the landlord. I told him I kept hearing noises upstairs. He said he hadn't been in that unit for weeks and that there was no one renting it yet. I asked if maybe there were animals inside the walls, but he said the attic access was sealed off, no raccoons, no squirrels. He sounded a bit annoyed, said he'd check it out later that week. That night, I decided to set up my small camera in the living room, facing the ceiling. I figured I could at least record the noise and show it to him later. Around 2:15 a.m., the sounds started again, clear as ever. The pacing, the creaks, the slow dragging noise that made the walls vibrate slightly. I stayed awake listening until it finally stopped, sometime after 3. Then I fell asleep on the couch, too scared to go to my room. In the morning, I checked the footage. The video was grainy. The light from the street barely reached inside. For a while, nothing happened. Then, around 2:20 a.m., I noticed something strange. The light in the room flickered faintly, and the ceiling above the camera darkened just slightly, like a shadow was passing over it. Then, for a split second, I saw something, a darker shape, like a crouched figure pressed against the ceiling near the small hatch that led to the crawl space between floors. It wasn't clear, but it looked like someone was there, hidden above me, just out of sight. I stared at the screen for a long time, rewinding it over and over. The shadow wasn't my imagination. It was there, solid and moving slightly. I froze, realizing that all those nights of footsteps might not have been coming from above the empty apartment, but from the narrow space between the ceiling and the floor above. Someone could have been crawling or walking through that small area, pacing directly over my head. That morning, I didn't go to work. I packed some things in a bag, left the apartment, and drove to my friend's place across town. I couldn't even go back inside to grab everything. I called the landlord again from my car and told him what I'd found. Told him to check the crawl space and that I wouldn't be returning until it was done. He didn't believe me at first, but said he'd get a maintenance worker to open it up. He called me later that evening, his voice uneasy. He said they found signs that someone had been living up there. Old food wrappers, an empty water bottle, and a small sleeping bag wedged between the beams. He thought maybe a homeless person or squatter had gotten in through one of the roof vents before the snow. They'd sealed it off afterward, but he didn't sound sure if they had caught whoever it was. I never went back. I asked him to pack my things and send them to me. To this day, I still think about the nights I lay there listening to those footsteps. The slow, steady pacing above me while I tried to sleep, not knowing that someone was hiding just inches away, crouched above the ceiling, watching and waiting in the dark. It was a Friday night in early spring, a night where the air felt calm but heavy, the kind that made every sound in the house feel sharper. My parents had gone to visit my aunt, and I had the house to myself for the night. It wasn't the first time I'd been home alone, but that night felt a little different from the start. Maybe it was because it was raining lightly outside, that slow, steady rain that made everything quiet. I had finished dinner, cleaned the dishes, and was sitting on the couch watching TV. The lights were dim, and I remember feeling that kind of lazy comfort that comes when you're alone but relaxed in your own space. The old landline phone was on the small table next to the couch. Hardly anyone used it anymore, but my mom kept it connected in case of emergencies. I almost forgot it existed. I was halfway through a movie when it suddenly rang. The sound was loud and sharp in the quiet living room. It startled me because no one really called that number anymore. I paused the TV and looked at the phone, waiting for it to stop. Kept ringing, so I picked it up. There was a pause on the other end, just the faint sound of breathing. Then a man's voice said, in a calm, almost casual tone, something like, "Hey, are you doing anything tonight?" I thought maybe it was a wrong number, someone who dialed the house by mistake. I didn't recognize the voice. I didn't even answer. I just hung up. I went back to watching TV, though the moment felt strange. There was something about the voice, it wasn't friendly, and it wasn't accidental either. It was too deliberate, too direct. But I tried not to overthink it. It was probably some prank. A few minutes passed. Then the phone rang again. I froze for a second. The sound cut right through the air, louder this time. I stared at the phone as it rang and rang. Against my better judgment, I picked it up again. I didn't say anything. The same voice spoke. This time, it sounded a little more forceful, like the person was annoyed. "Why did you hang up? I see you." I didn't respond. I just hung up fast, my hand shaking slightly. The words echoed in my head. "I see you." I stood up and looked around the room. The curtains were open a few inches, showing the faint glow of the streetlights outside. It was dark beyond that, too dark to see anything clearly. My chest felt tight, and I went around the living room, closing every curtain completely. Then I checked the front door to make sure it was locked. I even checked the back door, the one that led to the small yard. Locked. Everything was fine, or at least it should have been. But my mind wouldn't stop racing. I walked upstairs and looked out through the narrow window by the landing. The rain had picked up a little, the street empty, no cars, no people. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone really was out there. I tried to tell myself that the caller was bluffing. Maybe it was just some random person trying to scare whoever picked up. When I went back downstairs, I unplugged the landline just to stop it from ringing again. The silence after that felt thick, almost too quiet. The only sound left was the hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the wall clock. I turned off the TV, suddenly not in the mood to watch anything anymore. I sat in the kitchen with a glass of water, trying to calm down. My phone was charging on the counter, so I took it and checked if any unknown numbers had tried calling me there. Nothing. Everything was quiet again. After about 20 minutes, I started to feel a little foolish for being so tense. I even laughed under my breath, trying to convince myself it was nothing serious. I turned on the kitchen light, grabbed some chips, and walked back toward the couch. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The landline phone light, the small one that glowed when it was in use, was blinking faintly, even though I had unplugged it. I froze in place. That shouldn't have been possible. I reached for it slowly, my heart pounding, and picked it up. The cord was still attached, but the line wasn't dead. I could hear static, just faint white noise, mixed with something else, soft breathing again. I put the receiver down quietly and backed away. I picked up my cell phone and dialed the police. I didn't say much, just that someone had called the house twice and said they could see me, and that I thought someone might be nearby. They said they'd send a patrol car to check the property. The next 10 minutes were the longest of my life. I went upstairs and waited by my bedroom window, looking out into the street for any sign of flashing lights. The rain had turned into a steady drizzle, and the reflection of the streetlight made everything outside look blurry and distorted. Every sound in the house made me jump. The creak of the floor, the wind brushing against the windows, even the sound of water running in the gutters. When I finally saw the red and blue lights from a police car, I felt a rush of relief. I went downstairs to unlock the door for them. They came inside and asked a few questions while they looked around the house. I showed them the landline, the call log, and the unplugged cord. They took note of it and said they'd check the area outside. Maybe someone had been messing around. A few minutes later, one of the officers came back inside, his expression serious. He asked if anyone had been using the upstairs guest room recently. I said no, it was mostly used for storage. He told me to stay downstairs while they checked something. I stood in the living room waiting. The house felt unnaturally still. I could hear their footsteps upstairs, slow and deliberate. Then I heard one of them radio something in a low tone. After a moment, one of the officers came down and asked me to step outside. My legs felt weak as I followed him to the front porch. The rain was still falling, and the cool air hit me like a slap. He told me they'd found something strange. The phone line that connected to the landline in the living room had been tampered with. It had been split and rerouted through another small phone unit that was hidden in the guest room upstairs. Someone had been listening in, probably using it to make the calls. That meant whoever had called me wasn't outside at all. They had been inside the house the whole time. The realization made my body go cold. The officers swept the house again, checking closets, the basement, the attic, every possible place. Eventually, they found signs that someone had been living up there. There was an old blanket, a small flashlight, and some food wrappers. It looked like whoever it was had been hiding there for at least a few days. I stood outside under the rain, staring at my own house, knowing that while I had been sleeping, eating, walking around, someone else had been quietly moving through the same walls, listening. They never caught whoever it was. The police said the person must have slipped out before they arrived, maybe through the back when they saw the patrol lights. They couldn't find fingerprints clear enough to match anyone. My parents came home the next morning after I called them. They didn't say much. They just looked shaken. We had the locks changed that day. The phone line was removed completely. It's been years since that night, but I still can't stay home alone comfortably. Every time I hear the faint sound of a phone ringing, I get that same tight feeling in my chest. What really gets me, though, isn't the call itself. It's knowing how long that person might have been in the house before I ever picked up.